It was just a single digit off a frantic, tear-blurred typo sent into the digital void. Clara only wanted $50 to feed her starving infant. Instead, her message pinged the private burner phone of Chicago's most ruthless underworld boss, triggering a midnight visit that would rewrite their lives forever. The radiator in apartment 4B on West 18th Street gave a pathetic, rattling hiss before dying completely. Clara Hayes pulled the worn fleece blanket tighter around her shivering shoulders, but the freezing Chicago wind howling against the single-pane window cared nothing for her fragile defenses. In her arms, 6-month-old Leo was screaming, a thin, reedy sound that tore straight through her chest and settled like lead in her stomach. "I know, baby, I know," Clara whispered, her voice cracking as she rocked him back and forth. She paced the length of the cramped 10-by-10 living room, the floorboards groaning under her worn-out socks. She paused in the narrow galley kitchen, her eyes landing on the kitchen counter. The blue and white tin of baby formula was completely empty. She had scraped the last dusting of powder from the bottom of the can hours ago, watering it down to stretch it just a little further. It hadn't been enough. Leo's stomach was empty, and he was letting her know with every agonizing wail. Clara rested her forehead against the cold cabinet door, closing her eyes as tears spilled over her lashes. She had worked a double shift at the diner on Kedzie Avenue, but her manager, Greg, had shorted her tips again, claiming the register was off. Her bank account currently held exactly $4.12. Rent to Mr. Henderson was already 2 weeks late, and payday was still 3 agonizing days away. Desperation, raw and suffocating, clawed at her throat. She had no family left. Her mother had passed away 3 years ago, and Leo's father, a charismatic mistake named Tyler, had vanished the moment she showed him the positive pregnancy test. There was only Chloe Davis, her former coworker who had moved to a slightly better neighborhood in Lincoln Park. Chloe was barely scraping by herself, but she was the only lifeline Clara had left. With shaking hands, Clara fished her cracked smartphone from her pocket. The screen flickered, the battery flashing red at 9%. She opened her messages, her thumb hovering over the keypad. Her vision was so blurred by tears and exhaustion that the numbers swam together. She thought she was typing Chloe's number 31255500189. In her frantic state, her thumb slipped. She typed 0198. She didn't double-check the contact name. She just typed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Please tell me you have $50. Leo is screaming, and the can is empty. I'm begging you. I'll pay you back Friday. Please." She hit send. The message swooshed into the ether. Clara slumped against the kitchen counter, clutching the phone to her chest, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years for a quick reply. 5 miles away, deep beneath the glossy, towering skyline of the Loop, Silas Mercer was not thinking about baby formula. Silas stood in the center of a dimly lit, soundproofed warehouse down by Lower Wacker Drive. The air smelled of damp concrete, motor oil, and copper. At 32, Silas was the undisputed head of the Mercer Syndicate, a vast and lethal empire hidden behind the legitimate front of Mercer Global Logistics. He was a man carved from cold marble, impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit, his dark hair flawlessly styled, his jaw set in a permanent line of calculating cruelty. Right now, that calculation was focused on the man kneeling on the concrete before him, bleeding heavily from a split lip and a broken nose. "I'll ask you one last time, Frank," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm baritone that echoed off the high corrugated ceiling. "Where is the shipment from the docks? $3 million in untraceable pharmaceuticals doesn't just walk out of my port." Frank Rossi, a low-level lieutenant who had thought he could outsmart the syndicate, spat a wad of blood onto the floor. "I swear to God, Mr. Mercer, I don't know." "The feds? Don't lie to me," Silas interrupted, taking a slow step forward. The polished leather of his Oxford shoes tapped ominously on the concrete. Behind him, his second-in-command, Dante Reyes, stepped out of the shadows, idly twirling a heavy tungsten tactical knife. Before Silas could give the order to finish the interrogation, a sharp, vibrating buzz broke the tension in the room. Silas paused. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, encrypted satellite phone. It was a burner, but a highly sophisticated one. Only 4 people in the world had this number, and they were all currently standing in this room. He flipped the screen over. An unknown, unencrypted local number was glowing brightly. Silas's dark eyes narrowed. He opened the text message. "Please tell me you have $50. Leo is screaming and the can is empty. I'm begging you. I'll pay you back Friday. Please." Silence stretched in the warehouse. Silas stared at the glowing green letters. His mind, trained to see threats and conspiracies in every shadow, immediately began decoding the message. 50. 50 kilos? 50 grand? Leo. Leonardo Moretti, the boss of the rival West Side outfit. The can is empty. The warehouse has been cleared out. The stash is gone. Someone was mocking him. Someone had intercepted his private line, breached his airtight security, and was sending him a coded message about the missing shipment. They were telling him that Moretti had the goods, and they wanted $50,000 to reveal the drop location by Friday. A cold, lethal fury ignited in Silas's chest. He hated being played. He held up a hand, halting Dante's advance on the bleeding man on the floor. "Dante." "Yeah, boss?" Dante stepped forward, wiping the blade on a cloth. Silas handed him the phone. "Trace this number. Right now. I want exact GPS coordinates." Dante looked at the screen, his brows furrowing. "Who the hell is Leo? Moretti?" "That's exactly what I intend to find out," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Someone thinks they're clever. Someone thinks they can breach my inner circle, steal my freight, and extort me over a text message." Dante moved quickly to a heavy steel desk in the corner, plugging the phone into a specialized laptop equipped with military-grade tracking software. Fingers flew across the keyboard. Within 60 seconds, a red dot blinked onto a digital map of Chicago. "Got it," Dante said. "It's a burner, or at least a cheap prepaid. Bouncing off a cell tower near Pilsen. Pinpoints to a residential building on West 18th Street. Looks like a rundown apartment block." Silas adjusted his cuffs, his expression completely blank the face he wore right before he ruined someone's life. "Leave Frank," Silas ordered, turning toward the heavy steel door of the warehouse. "Bring the SUV around. We're going to West 18th Street. Let's see who has the balls to send me riddles at 11:30 at night." Midnight arrived, bringing with it a fresh onslaught of snow that whipped against Clara's window like handfuls of gravel. Inside the apartment, the silence was almost worse than the crying. Leo had finally cried himself to sleep, his tiny, tear-streaked face pressed against Clara's chest as she sat motionless in the rocking chair. She was terrified to move, terrified that shifting her weight would wake him up to the painful reality of his empty stomach. She checked her phone again. Black screen. The battery had died 20 minutes ago. Chloe had never replied. Chloe had never come. Clara felt a numb, hollow sense of defeat wash over her. Tomorrow, she would have to wrap Leo in 3 layers of blankets and walk 2 miles in the blizzard to a community pantry she had heard about in the South Loop. She didn't know how she would survive until morning, but she had to. She had no other choice. Suddenly, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed through the thin walls of the apartment. Clara's heart vaulted into her throat. Someone was pounding on the main downstairs door of the apartment building. The sound was violent, demanding. A few seconds later, she heard the heavy crash of the building's main entrance door being forced open, the lock splintering under immense pressure. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and multiple. They were coming up the stairs. Clara stopped breathing. She instinctively curled her arms tighter around her sleeping baby. Was it Mr. Henderson? No. The landlord was a coward who only harassed her through slipped notes and daytime phone calls. Was it a break-in? This neighborhood was dangerous, and robberies were common. But home invasions at midnight with this level of noise were rare. The footsteps stopped, right outside her door. Bang, bang, bang. The wood of her door shook violently. Clara jumped, a tiny gasp escaping her lips. Leo stirred, letting out a soft, distressed whimper. "Open the door." A deep, muffled voice commanded from the hallway. It wasn't a request. It was an order delivered by someone who was used to the world snapping to attention. Clara stood up slowly, her knees trembling so violently she thought she might collapse. She placed Leo gently into his thrift store crib in the corner of the room, tucking the blanket around him. She grabbed the only weapon she had, a heavy metal flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and crept toward the door. Who is it?" she called out, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to sound brave. "Open the door before we take it off its hinges," a different, sharper voice replied. Tears of absolute terror pricked Clara's eyes. She knew the lock on her door was flimsy. If they wanted in, they were getting in. Trembling, she unhooked the cheap chain and turned the deadbolt. She pulled the door open just a crack, keeping her foot pressed heavily against the bottom. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb, but it was enough to illuminate the nightmare standing on her welcome mat. It was a man. But not just any man. He was tall, over 6'2", with shoulders broad enough to block out the rest of the hallway. He wore a dark wool overcoat tailored to perfection over a dark suit. The casual, terrifying elegance of him was completely alien in her dilapidated building. Behind him stood another man, slightly shorter but heavily muscled, his hand resting casually inside his jacket. But it was the man in the front who stole the air from Clara's lungs. His face was a study in sharp angles and harsh shadows, his dark hair swept back, framing eyes that were a piercing, icy shade of gray. He looked at her through the crack in the door, and the sheer intensity of his gaze made her want to shrink into the floorboards. Silas Mercer stared down at the woman peeking through the 2-inch gap. This was not what he expected. He had expected an operative, a rival foot soldier, perhaps a desperate junkie hired by Moretti to send the message. Instead, he was looking at a young woman who couldn't be older than 24. She had pale skin, dark circles under large, terrified brown eyes, and messy, dark blonde hair tied back in a haphazard knot. She was wearing an oversized, faded gray sweatshirt and looked as though a stiff breeze could knock her over. "Where is he?" Silas demanded, his voice a low, lethal hum. Clara blinked, her grip tightening on the flashlight behind the door. "Who? Don't play stupid with me." Silas stepped forward, the toe of his expensive shoe nudging the door. Clara pushed back with all her weight, but it was useless. The door swung open a foot, pushing her back. "Leo, where is Leo?" Clara's breath hitched. How did this terrifying stranger in a $1,000 suit know her baby's name? Was Tyler involved in something dangerous? Had her ex sent these men? "He's asleep," Clara stammered, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "Please, don't wake him. Whatever Tyler owes you, I don't have it. I don't have anything." Silas frowned, a slight crease forming between his dark brows. Tyler? Before Silas could ask who Tyler was, a sharp, piercing wail erupted from the corner of the room. The loud voices had woken the baby, and the hunger returned with a vengeance. Silas froze. His icy gray eyes darted past Clara, scanning the cramped, freezing apartment. It took him exactly 3 seconds to assess the room. The peeling wallpaper, the dying radiator, the empty tin of Similac formula, sitting conspicuously on the kitchen counter, and the tiny, red-faced infant screaming in a cheap wooden crib. His mind, sharp as a diamond, rapidly replayed the text message. "Please tell me you have $50. Leo is screaming and the can is empty." It wasn't a code. There was no missing shipment. There was no cartel extortion plot. Leo was the baby. The can was the formula. 50 was just $50. Silas Mercer, the man who controlled half the illegal imports in the Midwest, who had men tortured for looking at him wrong, had just mobilized an armed convoy and kicked in a building door over a misdialed text message from a desperate, impoverished single mother. Behind him, Dante shifted awkwardly, having come to the same realization. He slowly pulled his hand out of his jacket, coughing into his fist. Boss?" Silas held up a single finger, silencing Dante instantly. He looked back down at Clara. She was vibrating with terror, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she looked between him and the crying baby, clearly expecting them to pull out guns and murder her. For the first time in perhaps a decade, Silas felt a strange, uncomfortable sensation tighten in his chest. It wasn't guilt. He didn't know how to feel guilt anymore, but it was something adjacent to it. A fierce, instinctual irritation at the absolute squalor this woman was standing in. The apartment was colder than the street outside. "You texted the wrong number," Silas said, his voice inexplicably softer than it had been a moment ago, though still commanding enough to make her flinch. Clara stared at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with confusion. "What?" Silas reached into the inside breast pocket of his tailored coat. Clara gasped and took a step back, raising the flashlight defensively. Silas ignored the pathetic weapon. He pulled out a sleek silver money clip, thick with $100 bills. Without a word, he peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills. He stepped fully into the apartment, invading her space, towering over her. She smelled like cheap vanilla soap and sheer panic. He reached out, took her trembling free hand, and slapped the $500 into her palm, folding her cold fingers over the cash. "Buy the kid some food," Silas ordered, his eyes locking onto hers, noting the faint freckles across her nose. "And get your radiator fixed. It's freezing in here." Clara stood paralyzed, looking at the fortune in her hand and then back up at the terrifying, beautiful man in her living room. I can't take this. I only needed 50. I don't know who you are. Keep it." Silas cut her off, turning on his heel. He walked back out into the hallway, his heavy coat swirling around his legs. He paused at the door, looking over his shoulder. "And be careful who you text, Clara." Her eyes widened impossibly further. How did he know her name? She hadn't realized her caller ID name might be attached, or that Dante had pulled her full telecom profile before they even got in the car. Silas didn't explain. He simply walked away, Dante trailing closely behind him. As they descended the stairs, Dante glanced at his boss. "So, not Moretti then?" Silas didn't smile, but his jaw tightened. "Tell the boys in the SUVs to stand down." "And Dante?" "Yeah, boss?" "Leave Marco parked across the street." "Tell him to watch the building," Silas commanded as they pushed out into the freezing Chicago snow. "And find out who the landlord is. I want a word with him about his heating." When Clara woke the next morning, the first thing she registered wasn't the agonizing cold that usually stiffened her joints. It was heat. A thick, radiating warmth blanketed the small room, accompanied by the rhythmic, healthy clanking of the ancient cast-iron radiator beneath the window. She bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs, the memories of the previous night rushing back in a terrifying flood. The splintered downstairs door, the terrifyingly beautiful man in the bespoke suit, the $500. Clara looked down at her right hand. The 5 crisp, $100 bills were still tightly crumpled in her fist. It wasn't a fever dream. Beside her, Leo cooed, a soft, contented sound she hadn't heard in days. She had managed to feed him a full bottle before collapsing into an exhausted sleep, and for the first time in a week, his stomach was full. A sharp knock at her apartment door made her flinch. She grabbed the heavy flashlight again, her bare feet padding silently against the warm floorboards. "Who is it? Miss Hayes?" It's Arthur. Mr. Henderson." Clara cautiously unhooked the chain and cracked the door. Her landlord, Arthur Henderson, a man who usually wore a permanent scowl and smelled of cheap cigars and stale beer, was standing in the hallway. He looked terrible. His left eye was severely bruised, swelling shut, and he was nervously wringing a tweed cap in his trembling hands. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Mr. Henderson? What happened to your face?" Clara asked, bewildered. "Tripped. I tripped down the stairs." "Miss Hayes," he stammered quickly, his voice pitched high with suppressed panic. "Listen, I wanted to apologize for the delay on the radiator and the door downstairs. I have a crew fixing it right now. I also wanted to tell you that your rent is paid up for the next 6 months. There was a clerical error on my end." Clara stared at him, her jaw dropping. 6 months? What are you talking about? I didn't pay." "It's paid!" Henderson practically shouted, taking a panicked step back as if he expected someone to leap out of the shadows and strike him. "Just, please, Miss Hayes, if there are any other issues, you call me directly. Day or night. Have a good morning. He practically sprinted down the hallway. Clara closed the door, sliding down the peeling wood until she hit the floor. The man from last night. Silas. He hadn't just given her money. He had terrorized her slumlord into fixing the building and forgiving her rent. Who exactly had she texted? What kind of power did a man wield to make a greedy, stubborn man like Arthur Henderson forfeit 6 months of rent and walk away with a black eye? Despite the lingering terror, Clara had to survive. She dressed Leo warmly, tucked the remaining $400 securely into her bra, and headed to her shift at Kedzie Diner. The diner was a greasy spoon that smelled eternally of burnt coffee and frying bacon. Clara tied her faded pink apron around her waist, plastering on a fake smile as she poured coffee for the morning rush. Her manager, Greg, yelled at her twice before noon for moving too slowly, but Clara barely heard him. Her mind was entirely consumed by the towering, gray-eyed phantom who had invaded her apartment. Around 1 o'clock, the lunch rush thinned out, the bell above the diner door jingled, and Clara looked up, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the man from the night before, but it was his shadow. The shorter, heavily muscled man who had stood behind him in the hallway, Dante. He walked into the dingy diner looking entirely out of place in a tailored black suit, his sharp eyes scanning the room before locking onto Clara. He didn't approach her directly. Instead, he sat at a corner booth facing the door, a position that offered him a clear view of the entire establishment. When Clara nervously approached with a notepad, her hands shaking, Dante offered a surprisingly warm, easy smile. "Just a black coffee, Clara," Dante said, his voice smooth. "How do you know my name?" Clara whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder at Greg, who was glaring at her from the grill. "My boss is a thorough man," Dante replied, casually dropping a $50 bill on the Formica table for a $2 coffee. "He just wanted to make sure you and the kid were doing all right today. Looks like you're working hard." Before Clara could push the money back or demand answers, the front door of the diner violently swung open. Clara's blood ran completely cold. Stumbling through the doorway was Tyler Brooks. Her ex-boyfriend looked worse than the last time she had seen him. Tyler's blonde hair was greasy and matted, his clothes hung loosely off his gaunt frame, and his pupils were blown wide. He moved with a frantic, jittery energy that instantly set off warning bells in Clara's head. "Clara!" Tyler spotted her and marched across the diner, ignoring the stares of the few remaining customers. "Hey, babe, I've been looking everywhere for you." I went by the apartment, but some massive guy in a suit was standing across the street and gave me a weird look, so I figured you'd be here. Clara took a step back, hitting the edge of a booth. "Tyler, you need to leave. You can't be here." "Come on, Clara, don't be like that," Tyler sneered, his tone turning desperate and aggressive. He grabbed her wrist, his grip painfully tight. "I need cash. Word on the street is Henderson got the fear of God put in him last night, and your rent is magically handled. You're holding out on me. I need $1,000. Right now. I'm in deep with Leonardo Moretti's guys." "I don't have any money for you," Clara hissed, trying to wrench her arm away. "Let go of me. You're hurting me." "Don't lie to me," Tyler snarled, raising his other hand. He never got the chance to bring it down. A hand clamped down on the back of Tyler's neck like a steel vise. In a blur of motion, Dante wrenched Tyler away from Clara, slamming the junkie face first into the nearest table. The salt and pepper shakers clattered to the floor. Tyler yelped in pain, his nose bleeding onto the laminated menu. "The lady told you to let go," Dante said pleasantly, though his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. He leaned down, twisting Tyler's arm painfully up his back. "And if you ever touch her again, I'll take a pair of bolt cutters to your fingers. Do we have an understanding, Tyler?" Tyler whimpered, nodding frantically against the table. Dante yanked him upright and physically threw him out the front door of the diner. Tyler scrambled onto the snowy sidewalk and bolted down the street without looking back. Dante dusted off his hands, turned to a stunned, trembling Clara, and picked up his untouched coffee cup. "My boss is going to be very interested to hear that your ex is mixed up with Leonardo Moretti. Have a good shift, Clara." Silas Mercer sat behind a massive mahogany desk in his high-rise office overlooking the Chicago River. The sky outside was a bruising purple, heavy with the promise of another blizzard. Dante stood on the other side of the desk, finishing his report. "He's a low-level tweaker, boss. Tyler Brooks. Owes Moretti's crew about 30 grand in gambling and drug debts." He was shaking Clara down at the diner. Silas remained completely still, his elbows resting on the arms of his leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The cold, logical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive and on top of the Chicago underworld for a decade, told him to walk away. He had done his good deed. He had given the girl money, fixed her heat, and put a scare into her landlord. Clara Hayes was a civilian, and Tyler Brooks was a dead man walking, but a darker, more possessive instinct flared in his chest. He couldn't shake the image of Clara's pale, terrified face in the crack of that door, or the sound of the starving infant crying in the freezing dark. Silas was a predator, but he was a predator with a very strict code. He protected what was his, and somehow, in the last 24 hours, his twisted psyche had categorized the girl and the baby as his. Tyler knows Clara has money, and he knows she has protection, Silas analyzed, his voice low and dangerous. If Moretti's men are pressing Tyler for the 30 grand, he's going to use her as a shield. He'll tell Moretti that I'm protecting his ex-girlfriend. Moretti will see it as a weakness. A way to get to me. Marco is still parked outside her apartment building, Dante noted. But if Moretti sends a full hit squad to grab her, they won't get the chance. Silas stood up abruptly, buttoning his suit jacket. The sheer violence radiating from him made Dante take a subtle step back. "Get the cars. We're getting her out of there." By the time Clara finished her shift and trudged through the snow back to her apartment, exhaustion was pulling at her bones. She picked Leo up from Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor down the hall, who watched him for a few dollars an hour, and unlocked her door. The moment she stepped inside, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The heat was still on, but the apartment felt entirely wrong. The heavy, suffocating scent of cheap cologne and cigarette smoke hung in the air. Well, well. Look who finally made it home, Clara gasped, clutching Leo tightly to her chest. Sitting on her worn-out sofa were 3 men she had never seen before. They didn't look like Tyler's junkie friends. They wore heavy leather jackets, thick gold chains, and expressions of casual cruelty. The man in the middle, a thick-necked brute with a jagged scar across his cheek, stood up. He held Clara's kitchen knife in his hand, idly cleaning his fingernails with the tip. "Who are you? Get out of my apartment." Clara backed up against the door, her hand fumbling behind her for the deadbolt. But one of the other men had already moved to block her. "Name's Dominic," the scarred man said, grinning. "We're friends of Tyler. He tells us you've got a new sugar daddy. Silas Mercer." I gotta say, I didn't think Mercer's tastes ran to washed-up diner waitresses with screaming brats. "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara said, her voice shaking violently. Leo began to cry, picking up on his mother's sheer terror. "I don't have any money. Tyler lied to you. Tyler said Mercer's goons paid off your landlord and roughed him up at a diner." Dominic stepped closer, the knife glinting under the harsh overhead light. "Mercer stole a very expensive shipment from my boss, Leonardo Moretti. We figure if we take you and the kid for a little ride, Mercer might be willing to trade the drugs for your lives." "No, please," Clara sobbed, sliding along the wall. "He doesn't care about me. I texted the wrong number. That's all it was. He's a stranger." "Guess we'll find out," Dominic sneered, lunging forward and grabbing Clara by the hair. Clara screamed, twisting violently to protect Leo as the man dragged her toward the center of the room. Before Dominic could drag her another foot, the hallway door exploded inward. The cheap wood shattered into 100 jagged pieces, the doorframe buckling under a massive, synchronized kick. Clara fell to her knees, shielding her baby, as the small apartment erupted into absolute chaos. Silas Mercer stepped through the ruined doorway, a suppressed tactical pistol in his hand. His gray eyes were entirely black with rage. Dominic barely had time to raise his knife before Silas fired twice. Pff, pff. The muffled shot sounded like a heavy staple gun. Dominic's knee shattered, and his right shoulder burst into a spray of crimson. He dropped the knife, screaming in agony as he collapsed to the floor. The other two goons reached for the guns tucked into their waistbands, but Dante and another heavily armed man poured into the room behind Silas. Within 3 seconds, both of Moretti's men were face down on the linoleum. Dante's boots planted firmly on their necks, weapons trained on the backs of their heads. The entire brutal confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. Clara was hyperventilating, huddled in the corner by the crib, clutching a wailing Leo. She stared in absolute horror at the blood pooling on her floor, at the groaning men, and finally, at Silas. Silas slowly lowered his weapon. The cold, ruthless mob boss melted away the moment he looked at her. He holstered the gun inside his jacket and crossed the room, dropping to one knee in front of her. He didn't care about the blood soaking into the knee of his expensive suit. "Are you hurt?" Silas asked, his voice a low, urgent rumble. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently hovering over her trembling shoulders, checking her for injuries. "You killed him," Clara stammered, staring at Dominic's bleeding body. "He's alive." "Barely," Silas corrected coldly, before softening his gaze back on her. "Clara, look at me." She forced her terrified brown eyes up to meet his intense gray ones. "Your ex-boyfriend painted a target on your back," Silas explained, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Moretti knows about you now. This apartment isn't safe. This neighborhood isn't safe. If I leave you here, they will come back, and I might not be 3 minutes away next time." Where am I supposed to go?" Clara cried, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "I don't have anywhere else." Silas stood up, towering over her. He reached down and gently but firmly pulled her to her feet, keeping one arm securely around her waist to steady her trembling frame. "You're coming with me," Silas stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable authority. "Pack whatever you and the baby absolutely need. You have 5 minutes. Dante will clean up this mess." "With you?" Clara gasped, her instinct telling her to run, but her logical mind knowing he was the only thing standing between her and death. "I don't even know you." "My name is Silas Mercer," he said softly, reaching out to gently wipe a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was shockingly tender for a man who had just shot someone without blinking. "And from this moment on, Clara, you are under my protection. No one will ever touch you or Leo again. Now, pack." The drive north to Lake Forest was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. Clara sat in the cavernous back seat of Silas's armored Maybach, clutching Leo tightly as the neon lights of Chicago faded into the sprawling, snow-covered estates of the North Shore. Silas sat across from her, his posture rigid, his dark eyes continuously scanning the dark roads, though his men were trailing closely in 2 heavily modified SUVs. Silas's home was a fortress masquerading as a modern architectural marvel, gated, heavily guarded by men in discreet tactical gear, and completely isolated from the prying eyes of the city. Inside, the contrast to her dilapidated West 18th Street apartment was staggering. Heated marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and a staff that moved with silent, terrifying efficiency. Silas bypassed the grand foyer and led her directly to a massive guest suite on the 2nd floor. A beautiful mahogany crib, stocked with pristine blankets and surrounded by every type of baby formula and supply imaginable, was already set up in the corner. Dante arranged it on the drive over. Silas explained, noticing her stunned expression. He finally unbuttoned his blood-stained suit jacket, tossing it onto a chair. The harsh, violent lines of his face softened infinitesimally as he looked at the sleeping infant in Clara's arms. "You're safe here, Clara, both of you." Over the next 3 weeks, the terrifying reality of Clara's situation morphed into a bizarre, luxurious domesticity. Silas was a ghost during the day, running a sprawling syndicate built on intimidation and control, but at night, he became a fixture in her wing of the estate. The profound shift in their dynamic came on a snowy Tuesday evening. Clara walked into the private living room to find the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, sitting on a plush velvet sofa, awkwardly bouncing a giggling Leo on his knee. Silas Mercer, a man who commanded legions of hardened enforcers, looked entirely out of his element and utterly captivated by the 6-month-old pulling fiercely at his expensive silk tie. He has a surprisingly strong grip, Silas murmured, looking up as Clara entered. The cold, dead look that usually haunted his gray eyes was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce warmth. "He likes you," Clara said softly, crossing the room and sitting beside him. The space between them, once filled with absolute terror, was now charged with a heavy, undeniable, and magnetic pull. Silas gently handed Leo over to her, his large, rough hand purposefully brushing against hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight through her chest. "Dante finished the negotiations with Moretti," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "A new territorial agreement was reached. Dominic and the others won't be a problem anymore. And your ex-boyfriend. Tyler has been given a one-way ticket to Anchorage, along with a very persuasive incentive never to return to the lower 48. Clara let out a shaky breath, a weight she felt like she'd been carrying for a month, finally lifting off her shoulders. "It's really over? The threat to you is over," Silas vowed. He shifted closer, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising to meet her eyes with a burning, possessive intensity. "I spent my entire life building impenetrable walls, Clara, amassing power and wealth to ensure nothing could ever touch me or make me vulnerable." He reached up, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "But one wrong number, one misdirected plea for $50, and you dismantled every defense I had, Silas." Clara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs, no longer out of fear, but out of a desperate, overwhelming affection. "You didn't just ask for help, Clara," Silas murmured, leaning in until his forehead rested against hers. "You gave me a reason to be human again." Clara closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, finally realizing the truth. The monster the rest of the world feared was the only true sanctuary she had ever known. The typo that was meant to be a desperate plea for survival had rewritten their destinies entirely, binding the broken waitress and the ruthless king together in a dangerous world where loyalty and love were the ultimate currency. A single, desperate typo bridged the impossible gap between a freezing slum and a billionaire's fortress. Clara sought a lifeline for her son. Instead, she found an unbreakable shield in a man who had forgotten how to care. In the unforgiving heart of the Chicago underworld, a misdirected text didn't just save two fragile lives, it breathed a soul back into a ruthless king.